Floodwaters have hit parts of the New South Wales south coast, with hundreds of people forced to leave their homes. People in Nowra and surrounding areas were warned that waters would peak overnight as the Shoalhaven River broke its banks. And further south, residents were told to leave Moruya and Sussex Inlet.
The State Emergency Service has received more than 800 calls for help in the past 24 hours, 400 of them from Sydney, where wild weather uprooted trees and damaged roofs. We'll get the latest from the SES in just a moment, but first to Jessie Dorset, who is in Sydney. Jessie, what's happened overnight?
Well, here in Sydney, Lisa, let's start in Sydney and then we'll talk about the south coast. There's been about 400 calls from the SES, to the SES, I should say. We're in the Western Sydney suburb of Cabramatta, and we can see here that a tree has fallen on the front fence here, smashing those bricks and unfortunately falling on somebody's car. It's fortunate, though, that it fell this way and not onto the apartment building. There are scenes like this across Sydney today as the SES received those calls. It was a wild night. You should have heard those howling winds. There's also been a bit of flash flooding in pockets of Sydney, so motorists should be wary on their way to work today. And
what about the evacuations further south we've been hearing about?
Yeah, this has come about because of heavy rain over the last few days from a low. Those evacuation orders were issued at Moruya and Sussex Inlet yesterday. And then further north at Nowra, we're yet to see the peak of the Shoalhaven River there. The SES performed 36 flood rescues. 6 of those were overnight, and they say that most of them were people who had driven into floodwaters. So I guess it's time that we all remember that saying, if it's flooded, forget it. Let's now hear from a local in Moruya.
It's pretty scary. It's hard for a lot of the town folk, those sort of isolated upriver. I know right now the guys are living in caravans and tents still after the fire. It's not good. So there's a lot of areas right around Moruya that are going to be in serious trouble.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Jessie Dorset, thank you. We're going to go straight to New South Wales SES Deputy Commissioner Daniel Austin, who's standing by for us. Daniel, good morning and welcome to breakfast. Tell us, what is the situation in that area? The floodwaters seem to be across quite a large patch of the New South Wales coast.
Yeah, good morning, Lisa. Certainly been a very wet and wild few days up and down the south coast. And there's a considerable amount of water laying around in general. Unfortunately, a lot of that has fallen into certain catchments, and the catchments you just mentioned in terms of places like the Shoalhaven, St George's Basin, including Sussex Inlet, and Moruya have all seen some pretty significant flooding levels. We saw some really intense rain bursts over the weekend. And that just dragged on for longer than was probably expected. And we'll now watch that over the next probably 24 hours or so until we see the peak in those waters, and we're confident that those waters are starting to recede.
Part of the problem, I imagine, would have been that they'd had so much rain already in that area, especially Sussex Inlet, so the ground would have been completely sodden.
Yeah, that's right. Already wet catchments mean that it certainly runs off much easier than it perhaps would have if we hadn't had that rain of a fortnight ago. But that certainly has, I guess, added to our problem. Included in that, though, when you look at some of the footage of some of those rivers, what you can also see is quite a bit of debris coming down those rivers. So again, we talk about not driving through floodwaters. There's another really good example as to why not. You just don't know what's under the surface. You don't know how fast that water's moving, and you certainly don't know how deep it is.
And what are some of the rescues that your volunteers and officers have had to carry out?
Yeah, so we started the weekend with some houses that were about to be impacted by floodwaters. And we assisted some residents. And then we've seen a number of the usual things of people driving into floodwaters. We've also seen, given there's a significant amount of rural community around here, a number involving livestock as well. But all in all, the communities, I think, heeded much of the warning about not driving through floodwaters. The numbers are relatively low in comparison of the whole lot that we saw compared to about a fortnight ago.
Yeah, and as Nate was saying before, Daniel, you know, we're seeing a high tide possibly a bit later, might not have seen the peak. It's certainly some dicey hours ahead.
Yeah, and the call rates for us will go up again as people wake and go about their day. So we'll watch the floodwaters. You're absolutely right. The high tide is a key point in our day. We'll see how that impacts and doesn't allow the water to drain out of the catchments. But also, as we've also seen, some pretty wild weather across the Sydney metro area as well, and a whole number of trees down and storm-related incidents. And that weather will work its way up the coast through today. Yeah,
Daniel, sorry, I should ask you about the Sydney experience. How many calls were you getting, and you know, what was the worst of what you were seeing? Mostly trees down?
Yeah, so approximately 400 calls we saw overnight through the Sydney metropolitan area. Yes, most of those were storm-related, so a lot of trees. We've seen some pretty big trees uprooted, and again, there's some pretty impressive imagery around about caravans and damage to houses from some of those big trees. So those winds will continue throughout the day. So again, our usual message is around be careful where you park, don't park under trees, secure things that are outside. And again, if you need to travel, be wary of where you're travelling. Check things like the live traffic app to make sure that the coast is clear.
Yeah, Daniel Austin, thanks for filling us in. Good luck with it all today.